Welcome to the show today. We're going to be discussing a new book, my dear friend John Barnwell, also my editor and one of my closest friends for 40 years, a book that he actually caused to have written. He indicated that I needed to write this book a long time ago. So we're going to discuss it today. How are you today, John?
I'm really doing quite well. As is my nature, did a lot of drifting, trying to consider what one might say in light of this most recent publication in the Rudolf Steiner collection that we've been assembling. And what can one say? I mean, to have it laid out before you, this path that is the ultimate path of human growth and development and fulfillment toward becoming spirits of freedom and love in preparation for joining the celestial hierarchies. I mean, personally, I don't think I'm worthy.
Yeah, you're probably not, but still, neither am I, and neither is anyone. I think you used to have this phrase. You can't seem to remember it now, but it was something Steiner had said that really there's nothing we've ever done to deserve the grace and mercy and love of the divine. I mean, really, most of us are extremely unconscious. And that's what Tibetan Buddhism is all about. And this book, Spiritual Enlightenment and Initiation, a new book, is all about Buddhism and anthroposophy. Now, in the old days, if you mentioned Buddhism to an anthroposophist, they rolled their eyes and wouldn't have a conversation with you. Now, when I was working on my second PhD, which was comparative religions, I must admit I slighted Buddhism. Why did I slight Buddhism? Because I'm a Christian. And why am I Christian? Because I have directly experienced Christ in the etheric realm. Now, once that happens, I don't care. Anything else that you ever had in your whole life is incidental compared to that.
Well, also, why are you a Christian? Because of where you were born. If you would have been born in Tibet, you would have been a Tibetan Buddhist. Or, in Central Asia somewhere, Tengris, So everybody has their version of this journey. And it's out of ultimate respectfulness that Rudolf Steiner approaches all the diverse developmental streams of humanity that have contributed to this vast mosaic. And so it behooves one to have a certain measure of humility when approaching the mysteries that come to you from other lands, because just perhaps, you don't really know what they're talking about.
That's for sure. In comparative religions, as I was studying it, because I was such a diehard Christian, I really didn't pay enough attention to Buddhism. And then I met John Barnwell, and he worked at the Mayflower Bookshop, probably the most comprehensive collection of esoteric Christianity and comparative religion and many other topics, astrology and so on and so forth, at the Mayflower Bookshop. And one part of the Mayflower Bookshop, when it was in Berkeley, was in the back. It was a section that had, I don't know, John, 10,000 books on Buddhism. I mean, I'd go back there and I'd just get completely confounded looking at all this stuff going, this is going to drive me insane. Okay. I thought there was like Buddhism. And then I found out there's like 50 types of Buddhism. And then I found out that Tibetan Buddhism had 4 schools. And then with a lot of deep research, I found out the source of the original Tibetan Buddhist teaching, which is a religion called Bon, B-O-N, or Bonpo. And now I'm kind of obsessed with trying to get everything I can in English on Bonpo, because that's the original source of Tibetan Buddhism. Now, let's go back to anthroposophy and Buddhism. Besides Hermann Beck, who was one of the original Christian community priests, I cannot think. No, I'm thinking, and I can't think of a single person in anthroposophy that's ever mentioned Buddha. But as I'm back in the section of Buddhism with John Barnwell, he's saying, well, you know, Steiner said that the Nirmanakaya of Buddha overlighted Jesus Christ and then moved into, Jesus of Nazareth before his baptism. And then after the baptism, the Nirmanakaya, which is basically the Enlightenment body, we'll go a lot into that in a minute, but the Enlightenment body of Buddha was the star above Christ's cradle when he was born. That's the star that the Magi followed. And then it entered into John the Baptist, into his I am, and basically filled him with the wisdom that Buddha had accumulated from many incarnations. Now, this talk, in general, anytime I do a talk in one of these books, I have everything in my head I'm going to say. I have nothing in my head I'm going to say today, because I don't know how in the world to present this, because people are going to think that this is very strange, that here we have an anthroposophist two anthroposophists talking about Buddha. I mean, why? And what does that have to do with Christianity? Matter of fact, most would think it has nothing to do with Christianity. But I'm going to tell you a few stories today, I'm sure, that will perhaps shed some light upon this. But I just want to first mention what is in this book. First off, this book is called Spiritual Enlightenment and Initiation. Now, when you're talking to a Buddhist and you're talking about enlightenment, unless you're talking to a geshe, which is a PhD in Tibetan Buddhism, or a High Lama, or a Rinpoche, they don't know anything more than the fact that Buddha attained enlightenment. And one would think naively that Buddhism believes that enlightenment is the highest stage of spiritual development, but it's not. If you understand Buddhism, especially Buddhism, which the distinction here is that Tibetan Buddhism merged ancient Hindu philosophy with the incarnation of Buddha and merged it also with the ancient teachings of a previous Buddha. Now, that gets people all warped out when I say there's previous Buddhas. There have been multiple Buddhas, but most people have only heard of Gautama Buddha, Sakyamuni Buddha. And basically, the original Tibetan teachings all came from basically the parts of Tibet called Mustang, northern Pakistan, the Hunza Valley, the Gimlet Valley, all these high northern valleys way, way up in the mountains where they have very, what would you call it, communities that in some cases hadn't even reached the outside world, hadn't reached them for a long time. Think of Hunza, the people they say live naturally to 125 years old. They hadn't realized that those people even existed until our modern times. And so when you go in and you look at Tibetan Buddhism, which is a mental path of development for spiritual advancement, it is truly detailed. It is the most detailed description of mental development anywhere. Western philosophy does not hold a candle to Tibetan Buddhism when it comes to defining the stages of mental development. So for a person like myself or John, of course we're going to get into Buddhism because we're going to take what it has given in the past. Because in the past, as John just pointed out, if we were born in those places, we would simply probably develop a relationship to that religion that would not be really connecting to its original sources, because those sources go back to, according to Bonpo, the Buddha at that time was called Tampa Shinrab Miwoche. That's a book John just got me and gave me for my birthday, and I'm reading it voraciously. Because why? You can't get Bonpo doctrine and dogma translated into English. It's most things in the whole world are translated into English, but these are not. And the reason for that is the following, and it's not a nice reason. And besides my friend, the Dalai Lama, who I've had extensive conversations with about Bonpo, and his teacher, who is my root guru, because I studied Tibetan Buddhism for many, many years. I've met many, 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 many Tibetan Buddhists of all the 4 different schools. I've never met a Bonpo yet, Bonpo Lama. But basically, when you're discussing this with Buddhists, It is absolutely fascinating because Buddhism, I'm sorry to have to say this because I love Buddhism, but Buddhism is just a big basket of contradictions, okay? Because they'll tell you that, for instance, reincarnation, their form of reincarnation is not what we Westerners think of as reincarnation, which is repeated human incarnations on the earth. No, no, no. They believe in metapsychosis. They believe in transmigration. They believe in a form of what we call reincarnation that if you explain this to a Westerner, they'd say, well, of course I don't believe that. For instance, I've had, this is an example that many Buddhist teachers tell you. If you happen to be eating a ham sandwich and you choke on it and you die, since you were focused at the moment of death on a pig, you could reincarnate as a pig. Now, that's insane, okay? That's not the way it happens. And also, think of it. I don't know a High Lama Tibetan teacher who basically wasn't aware of their previous incarnation. So the Dalai Lama is the 14th Dalai Lama, or whatever he is. There's in a row, they're the same person reincarnating over and over and over again. All the top, to the Karmapa, the Dalai Lama, all of the top leaders of the different schools will say that they reincarnate, but they'll tell everyone in the audience that they don't reincarnate. They live, and then when they die, they merge into the big Buddha in the sky. And it's like, what? You get to reincarnate, but I don't? Well, what are you teaching me? And so eventually I got very, very frustrated with some aspects of Tibetan Buddhism, and it was only Steiner's insights that brought me around to be able to say, yes, I'm going to very seriously study Buddhism, specifically Tibetan Buddhism, and study with some of the highest teachers in the world, actually. Gela Rinpoche, the Dalai Lama, the head of the Nyingma, my second root guru, Ludingkin Rinpoche, who's the head of the Sakyapa tradition, Jetsun Kushala, who is the living embodiment of the greatest female Buddha, Vajrayogini. So I've had so many experiences in this that in a way, I don't even know where to start to help you. But this book is what John asked me to do. Years ago, John said, look, you have gone so deep into Tibetan Buddhism. Can't you write a book on connecting Tibetan Buddhism and anthroposophy? And lo and behold, John, I did what you said. And thank you so much for editing it. I think it's a marvelous book. I think it'll make some real stodgy anthroposophists get really upset, because in this book we show that, and Rudolf Steiner said in Knowledge of Higher Worlds and in other places, that his teaching was connected to the ancient traditions, as it would have to be if it was a true tradition. So some of these things in the books that I list here, the stages of knowledge, the Knowledge of Higher Worlds, occult science, so on and so forth, spell out the same almost exact path of mental development that Rudolf Steiner describes, and can be found in Tibetan Buddhism in what is called the Lam Rin practice, which I practiced for about 10 years, or the Lojong practice, which I practiced for many years, and also Dzogchen, which is the oldest form of quick enlightenment that comes from the Nyingma school, which is the oldest of the 4 Tibetan schools. So this is directly related to anthroposophy, whether anthroposophists want to admit it or not.
Yes, and any reasonable individual would be capable of understanding that you can't really address the truth without it linking to truth that existed before you came to that truth. That there is a point at which truth has a beingness, right? But when you approach being and you're approaching being, once you approach it, it manifests as an entity, that it becomes an actual presence. So, for example, say in Buddhism, they would say shunyata, emptiness. You go, okay, you want to achieve emptiness. But the ultimate realization that results from achieving that emptiness is a fullness. Now, wait a minute. So you see that there's this dynamic activity that takes place when one is taking this up, and that really you have to realize that what you are is involving yourself in a process. And it's a process that didn't begin when you started pursuing it, that it was something that was here and had actually always been here, is that there is a process of consciousness. But the formal considerations, the linguistic trappings, as what have you, all have to go through a change based on cultural considerations, location, and what particular individual is addressing it, what is their karma, what is their level of comprehension. And so it can get pretty confusing if you don't have a way of working through it. And that's what Rudolf Steiner gives you. He gives you a means whereby you can approach the mysteries of the ancient world and bring them into a harmonious cosmology and develop a memory theater that's based on understanding. And that's the key, because a truth, what is the value of a truth? It's when you understand it.
You're so right. The Tibetans call that Prajnaparamita, the being of wisdom, or Manjushri, who is a really interesting deity who has a sword, and he's the being of wisdom. And if you're studying him and you're praying to him and you're doing all these rituals that the Buddhists give us, and you lose your concentration, he chops your head off with a sword. That's how serious these people are about this stuff, okay? I mean, it's life and death for Buddhists, especially Tibetan Buddhists. Now, with Rudolf Steiner, for instance, as I said to John yesterday on the phone, I can't think of a single anthroposophist in my entire life, and mind you, I've known many, many, many all over the world, who ever once mentioned Buddhism. And so when they found out that I was a Buddhist and I was studying with the teacher of the Dalai Lama, Gaelic Rinpoche, here in Ann Arbor at the Jewel Heart Temple, they were ready to, kick me out and say, man, I'm really off the path. Yes, Hermann Beck, a Christian community priest I mentioned, and he wrote a book on Buddhism because he was a professor of Buddhism. And did the other Christian community priests say anything about Buddhism? No. So here's one voice out of the entire Anthroposophical Society in its entire history that I know actually addressed Buddhism.
Yes, he was a professor at the University of Berlin in Oriental Studies, and he was conversant in most of the ancient languages and most of the modern ones. And so he was one of the most educated people in all of Europe. And he ended up attending the works of lectures of Rudolf Steiner and became involved with the Christian community and started writing these books. And to be perfectly honest, what happened is that Friedrich Rittelmeyer and Emil Bach, who were really kind of the two central figures in that impulse, they didn't know what to do with it. So they didn't print them. And so these things have lain around for all these years until finally now they're being released. So you see that this is kind of a tardy response on our part, so to speak. But we have the advantage because since the days of Hermann Beck, a great deal more, as Douglas has just shared with you, has come forward regarding the details of that particular approach. So that's part of the beauty of it. And I don't want to intimidate anybody by thinking, well, I can't do all that stuff. And this is, as the poet Novalis once said, the fairy tale is mightier than philosophy.
Yes, and as Novalis said, history must become now a fairy tale. In other words, we must be able to see the real ethical teachings of history that can be extracted by looking at karma. And of course, karma and reincarnation are words out of Eastern philosophy that so many people misunderstand in this day and age. And it's certainly the Western interpretation of those words, or any words connected to the East, and Hinduism, the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, Buddhism. They all have to be adjusted, because those were true when they were given. Now, mind you, I'm going to say some things here today that even Buddhists may be a little bit disturbed by, but it's the truth. Really, Tibetan Buddhism all started when the first school of Tibetan Buddhism, called Nyingma, or Nyingma, basically, I'm sorry to have to say this, they genocided the Bompo people. They literally killed them, took their writings and destroyed them. And there's still a tradition called the Terma tradition. And in Mustang, in old stupas, to this very day, they're finding in the stupas, or in caves or under rocks, and hidden these secret teachings of the Bompo culture, which goes back to Zhangzung. And they say that their Buddha, Tampa Shinrab Miwoche, was around 10,000 BC. So you're talking about things that are prehistory that no one can actually verify. But recently they did they found the city of Zhangzung, and it had been untouched. No archaeologists had ever been there. And these caves, these retreat caves for Nyingma Rinpoches and lamas, were still filled with their secret texts, just sitting there strewn about on the floor of the cave. That's how little Nyingma acknowledges their relationship to Bonpo. Now, why am I focusing on this? Because Rudolf Steiner said that, and this is shocking to anthroposophists, that there's 3 stages. The first stage is called preparation, or catharsis. Now, in every spiritual tradition, they'll say you must go through all kinds of oblations and offerings and development of your moral character, what the Hindus would call, or Buddhists would call, sutrayana, which means developing your morality by reading these beautiful things like the Diamond Sutra or the Heart Sutra over and over and over again, until they literally become a moral force in you. But moral force can only be expressed to another human being. So they'll tell you there's 2 paths in Buddhism: Hinayana and Mahayana. Hinayana is when you want to develop yourself alone, and you don't even practice with other people. You only practice on yourself. Guess what? That will not get you to enlightenment in one incarnation. That's what you have to do, is your preparation. So like with Pythagoras, you couldn't eat beans and you couldn't eat meat. And, before you'd enter into the school of Crotona, the Pythagorean school, you had to go through all kinds of incredible preparation. So Steiner calls this catharsis, okay? So preparation for him is to study spiritual content, really good spiritual content that is completely applicable in today's world. Now that stage is stage 1. Then there's a stage 2 and a stage 3. They don't happen necessarily in that order. So stage 1, preparation. All of us that intend to develop your spiritual nature could be on the path of preparation. And then, shockingly, and when you tell this to an anthroposophist, they're ready to clear the room and write you off. You must attain enlightenment before you can start on the path of initiation, according to Rudolf Steiner. So it's catharsis, or preparation, enlightenment, and then initiation. So you have to say, but wait a second. Buddha transcended. He received the rainbow body. He went. He's not incarnating anymore, and he reached enlightenment. Well, yes, but in the story, he did not reach the other 2 stages. So the first stage of enlightenment in Buddhism is called Nirmanakaya. As I just mentioned, the Nirmanakaya that Rudolf Steiner calls the spirit self, the first of the 3 stages of your spiritual ego, or I am, spirit self, life spirit, spirit human. In Hindu, in Hindi, or in Parsi, or in many different Indian religions, these are called manas, buddhi, and atman. And what they will tell you is that Atman is the I am in you, the most highly developed spiritual side of yourself. And when you get there, then your Atman merges with the ultimate divine being, which is kind of like what we'd call Father God. So your Atman merges with Brahman. And when you go to the Upanishads, it says that's the entire intent of all spiritual development, is to take your highest spiritual self and merge it with the Brahman. Problem is that when those things were written, the human ego was so young and in its beginning stages of growth that you really didn't have much of an ego. So when you died, you really didn't have what we would call the memories of an ego from a past life when you incarnate again. So it almost would be okay to say that in the ancient times with Bonpo, with the Nyingmapa, which was much, much later than Bonpo, you could say that they're saying that you don't have an ego. And that's the reason your ego merges into the Brahman. So these are really bizarre, refined distinctions that we're going to try today to clear up a few of these. So first stage is preparation. Second stage is enlightenment. What is that about? Let's take Jakob Burma. Jacob Bohm. He was a cobbler. One day he's standing outside his shop looking through the window, and a pewter bowl is in the window. He sees the sun shine in the pewter bowl. It goes into his eyes, and bingo, bango, he has the golden moment of enlightenment, the golden moment of illumination, or instantaneous enlightenment. And according to the story, he then was able to speak multiple languages, though he wasn't educated in them, and he became one of the greatest spiritual writers of all times. Okay, so are you suggesting that enlightenment can happen in a moment? Oh, yes, it can. So all that preparation up to the point of enlightenment, could enlightenment happen before all the preparation is done? Yes, it can. Why does enlightenment happen? It's not because you desire it so much to get it, or that you pray, or that you do all these. I have sat for 3 weeks and done 10,000 meditations in a row, only stopping to eat a little bit, because that's the Tibetan Buddhist path, is the Lamrim, which is that path I'm describing now, with having to do the Lamrim meditation 10,000 times in a retreat. That's a beginning stage. That is not enlightenment. And that is not the stages of initiation. That is the beginning stage. So you can prepare, you can pray, you can meditate, you can visualize, you can try to embody the deity, all these different things. Doesn't mean you're going to reach enlightenment. And then you might meet a person who's a janitor who starts talking to you, and you know this person's enlightened. Do they know they're enlightened? Yeah, you'd have to know you're enlightened if you're enlightened, because why? You can now look at your own thoughts and study the process of thinking, which connects you to the angels. Enlightenment, Nirmanakaya, monastic thinking, and or the spirit self are one and the same. It's the angelic realm. So when Buddha attained enlightenment, he reached into the realm of the angels. Now, Rudolf Steiner tells us that realm is also called the realm of moral imagination, not fantasy, not imagination, moral imagination, which means when you get an image, that image is true because it's not you creating it, it's an angel moving through you. Well, again, that is the stage of enlightenment. Can people attain that stage without anthroposophic or Tibetan Buddhist moral development in the stage of preparation? Yes, they can. People are stricken sometimes with enlightenment, but that is not the 2 stages higher. So ancient Bonpo, Tapashin Rinpoche is one of my favorite people in all of history or prehistory. And I have attempted to get whatever I can in English to study because he is amazing. Bonpo religion was matriarchal. There were no priests. It was the women who did the magic. And Bonpo was very much shamanistic. And so when you study this, you go back to the most ancient times when the matriarchy was still in force before the patriarchal priests took over. Now, that's what happened with Tibetan Buddhism. The male priest said, we're going to remove ourselves from the world. we're going to do Hinayana. We're not going to do Mahayana. They call it Hinayana is the small boat. Mahayana is the big boat. The big boat is when you've reached enlightenment. In all cases, you are so sparked with courage, moral, spiritual courage, that you must come back and share your experience with others so that they might reach that experience. That's how you know you've reached enlightenment. And you'll also realize you're communing with higher beings, just as John said. So the Tibetan Buddhists, and I've had endless conversations with top lamas, amazing leaders of these different schools, and they'll give you the most interesting answers because they are pure clairvoyant people. As a matter of fact, John knows this very well. When I first met the Dalai Lama, I'm in a line of hundreds of people in Ann Arbor at Hill Auditorium, and we're walking through this line. I don't know. Weren't you right there with me when that happened? Yeah. So the Dalai Lama, I think you were in front of me, and he was taking a silk scarf, and he blesses it and puts it on around your neck, and then you go on, right? Hundreds of people. He gets to me, and he looks at me, and he goes, "Oh." He turns to Gaelic Rinpoche, who was my guru, and who had invited him to Ann Arbor, and says, "This is the teacher." And Gaelic Rinpoche says, yes, this is the teacher I told you about. And so he puts his head on my forehead and says, I don't know how many times, keep teaching the children. Please keep teaching the children. Keep teaching the children. And he says this so many times, it's like, okay, I'm trying to pull my head away from his forehead because I'm embarrassed. All these people are watching. So, and then he says, he turns to Gaelic Rinpoche and says, I'm done. Clear the room. And like, I'm standing there, and he puts his head back on my forehead. The room clears. Even my friends, they went out one door. Others went out the other door. And he continues to say the same thing. Keep taking care of the children. Take care of the children. Keep teaching the children. He keeps saying this to me. And then afterwards, he turns to Gaelic Rinpoche and says, prepare a place on the dais. And I don't know what that means. And then we walk out onto the stage, and they're making a seat for me at the same height as the Dalai Lama. And I refuse to sit there, I'm like totally freaked out. I'm not going to do that. I don't even know what's happening, okay? I didn't know Tibetan Buddhism well enough to even understand what's happening. But when there's a Tibetan Buddhist meets you, if they recognize you from a previous incarnation and you were as high as they were or higher, they insist they cannot teach unless you are sitting in a chair higher than them or at the same level. That's the reason I left Buddhism, because they kept doing that to me. And I'd say, no, I'm sitting in the back in a chair. Oh, no, then I cannot teach you. And they'd call me the same name. John, you know this. They would all call me a name. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know who that person was in history or anything like that. How is it that dozens of Tibetan Buddhists who didn't know me from Adam, they meet me and they go, oh, Zambo Wambo, it's so great to see you again. Oh, so thank you so much for your great mercy and your tatrati and all this stuff. They say the same exact thing. Because why? They're all clairvoyant. So I don't remember an incarnation as a Buddhist. All right. I have one moment of it with my wife that, boom, I saw something. I don't know what it was. But anyway, they're basically telling me this, and they said, oh, it's okay. And then they tried to convince me to learn Tibetan Buddhism and the language Tibetan and join in. And so I joined in for 20 years or something. And everywhere I'd go, there'd be like another high lama. I went to Hawaii, and the Nechung Rinpoche, the highest lama in any tradition, who goes and figures out by looking at the sacred lakes in Tibet and looking at the Tibetan letters that appear above the lake, and they put them together, and it tells them where to find the next lama they're looking for, whether it's the Dalai Lama or the Karmapa or whatever. Well, I met the Nechung Rinpoche, and he asked me to come and be the next Nechung Rinpoche. And I'm like, and I didn't know what even that meant when he invited me. And then that was at the time when I met also and became connected to the Sakyapa tradition through Ludingken Rinpoche and the king and queen of the Sakyapa tradition and the Sakyapa Tulku of Vajrayogini. I met all those, and they all kept saying the same thing to me. Oh, it's so great to see you again. And there's like, oh, we're going to work together again or whatever. They had these ideas. Where did they all get that? Where did that come from? Their memory is one memory. So when you see a lama start teaching, you'll see his head goes back. This huge thing happens behind his head that is like a memory theater. And they have the most astounding memories of any people I've ever met in my whole life. They have so many texts memorized. You can't imagine that they do. They can do a 3-week long, which I have done, 3-week long retreat every day, 8 to 10 hours a day without using any notes. It's all memorized. Okay. So they have what we would call a group soul memory. And so that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with this being of truth that John was talking about. But let's remember, truth from ancient times. Christ has incarnated since then and changed the whole picture.
Yes. And of course, that's just entry level understanding, the just radical comprehensiveness of what Douglas just said. But you have to add, and because when you start to look at these things in terms of spiritual economy, as Rudolf Steiner described it, you could have an individual standing before you, and you know this person, you went to junior high with them, but you never knew that they have the astral body of St. Francis of Assisi indwelling them, right? And the Tibetans would call that toku, that there is a vehicle that is a part of what we'll call the entelechy. The entelechy will say that's the combined levels of being of which you, in the current moment, are occupying. And so on one of those levels, you're in some way, and there's numerous ways in which it can occur, you may actually incarnate the astral body of St. Francis, or it could be an imprint of the astral body of St. Francis, or it could be an overshadowing of the astral body of St. Francis for a period of time to give you particular inspirations while you're being guided along a particular part of your personal journey. And so we mustn't get carried away with these ideas, because frankly, until you know, you don't know. And in fact, most people don't know they don't know.
Absolutely. And I didn't know a lot. And I just stumbled into these things because I was clairvoyant. And literally only yesterday in the book John just gave me did I finally figure out ultimately who that person they were calling me really was. And I'm not going to go into that, but I'll tell you what, I think they're all mistaken. I think maybe I resemble that, but there's no way that I am what they said that. So I don't know what that means or what that, so I'm not claiming anything. And by the way, I'm not a Buddhist. I'm a Christian. And every Buddhist I ever met, I'd say, hey, you're wasting your time on me because I'm a Christian. And I've experienced Christ in the etheric. So, unless you can tell me that you know that Christ is in the etheric, then first off, I'm not going to rank you as a high teacher. So I would get into these debates, and Tibetans love to debate. So I'm with Ludington Rinpoche, and we're in a 3-week retreat getting the highest yoga tantra initiation called Vajrayogini, which also my Galupa teacher, Gaelic Rinpoche, also gave me. So I've had that from 2 different traditions. And they say, for instance, if you're a monk and you're in the Hinayana path, you may have to incarnate 5-6 times with absolute pure morality each incarnation before you are even invited to come to this ritual. But when you do this ritual, if you maintain it and you do the practice every single day, they guarantee that you will reach enlightenment in this incarnation or guaranteed in the next incarnation. And if you have to go to a next incarnation, that they will somehow your karma will lead you to the same Vajrayogini initiation that then will give you the chance in that incarnation to reach enlightenment. Well, okay, I ain't enlightened now, so I guess maybe next time I'll have a chance to reach enlightenment. But here's the deal. Enlightenment, I'm sorry to have to say this, it's not a big deal. It is nothing compared to initiation. Okay, it's the first step. It's a step to show you where you need to go. It's like when you meet an angel, first time you meet an angel, okay? First off, unless it's your guardian angel, they're not going to be alone. And if you really are ascending into heaven when you see this angel, then you're going to see archangels and time spirits, and you can see all kinds of beings up the ladder of the spiritual hierarchy because they're all connected. So I would say to Ludingren Rinpoche or Gelek Rinpoche or the Dalai Lama, look, I'm a Christian. Christ is alive in the etheric realm of the earth. Anyone who's clairvoyant can see that. And so I go on and on. They look at me and go, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? And they go, oh, you mean Avalokiteshvara? Or they give me, whatever school they're from, they give me a name of a being. And this is beautiful. Avalokiteshvara. Let me tell you his history. He was a human. Chenrezig, who is the being of love, who, by the way, that's who the Dalai Lama is the Tulku incarnation of, is Chenrezig, right? Which is basically, to the Tibetan Buddhists, that's Christ. But they describe it as this being is this way. He was a human, and he was going around looking at all the suffering in the earth. And it affected him so profoundly that one day in meditation, his head exploded from looking at the suffering of all of the human beings and trying to figure out how he could help them. So his head exploded. Well, that's okay, because out of that head, 11 other heads grow. So when you see Avalokiteshvara, he's got these heads, and it goes up to the head of the Buddha that controls that school, that Tibetan school. And then Avalokiteshvara, when he was able to see in all directions with all these heads, said, okay, now give me the tools to help them. So he sprouted 1,000 arms, and in the palm of each arm was an eye that could see the suffering. And then in that hand, it would hold one of the many, many spiritual tools that can help you reach enlightenment and higher stages of initiation. So you see the statue. So when you see a statue with these multiple heads, 1,000 arms, and the everything from the bell, the dorje, the mala, the bow and arrow, the sword, every spiritual tool that there is, which also is defined in Christianity as the armor of God. But this being then now is on the realm of the etheric. He's a living being. He's never really died, and he doesn't leave the earth, and he surrounds the earth. And anytime you have suffering, he sees it, and then he offers you the tool to overcome that suffering. That's Avalokiteshvara, which also Kuan Yin, some would say Kuan Yin is a female derivative of that. And as John said, Chenrezig, and there's many other names for this being. Well, that's one of my favorite beings. So I would say to Gelek Rinpoche or Ludingren Rinpoche or the Dalai Lama, I'd say, yeah, but is Avalokiteshvara Christ? And they go, I cannot tell you that. I don't know. Well, do you directly experience Avalokiteshvara? Yes. He's a living being. And every time I speak about compassion, I'm speaking with his voice. It's like, okay, compassion. And as Rudolf Steiner pointed out, there's actually 6 stages of compassion that you develop in Tibetan Buddhism. No stages for love. Not a single reference that I've ever seen to love. Compassion, kindness, being good to other people, following the golden rule, all that, yes. Love, no. So Rudolf Steiner says that Tibetan Buddhism, and that Buddha himself, Gautama Buddha, Sakyamuni Buddha, was one of the greatest beings who ever lived, and certainly one of the greatest thinkers who ever lived, Rudolf Steiner said. And he laid out the path to develop compassion. But he did not lay out the path to reach the being of love. So unless you are really, really educated in Buddhism, and unless you're talking to a High Lama, you're not going to get their response to tell them that basically they believe in the etheric Christ.
Yes, you'll find it. And people think that you're getting lost in the semantic weeds, so to speak. But it is a reality that the word love is in the Gospel of John, like what, I think 17 times, which is more times than it is to be found in the other Abrahamic scriptures, right? But all of them put together, by the way, if you combine all of them, you don't have that many references to love. And then when you start looking at it in a more detailed way, you see that, well, this is referring to your consideration of your family, and this is, you know, for your people. And so it starts getting to be narrower and narrower. And so it's this love thing that is so unique regarding what Christ came to bring, because he literally actually manifested it in a human form. And so he's unique amongst all other avatars or tulkus or manifestations or what have you, in that he is a complete manifestation of the human being in its full potential within Earth evolution, and to serve as a prototype. And so if you're not overwhelmed by that, then you might want to think about it for a little while. But that's a very big consideration. And when you get to what, again, going back to Novalis, geez, I just let it drop behind me there. Where'd it go? Here it is. Sorry. He says, the heart is the key to the world and to life. One lives in this helpless situation in order to love and to learn of one's dependency on others. Through imperfection, one becomes open to the influence of others. And this openness is just the point. In sickness, others can and should help us. So Christ, from this standpoint, is the key to the world.
You see, that kind of a modern view compared to ancient Tibetan Buddhism or Bangpo is what we need. We need to be able to understand it in our own terms. In the old terms, basically all the old lineages are no longer perfectly appropriate for our time. So we have to bring things up to date. Now, I am not demeaning Buddhism in any sense of the word, or Hinduism, or any religion. I love them all. I think they're all valid in their own right. But we must put them in a time perspective so that we know when they were the most valid. But Buddhism, there's so many amazing, for instance, Buddhism says, oh, somebody bothers you? Good, rejoice, because they're showing you the part of yourself you haven't refined. So they should become your best friend. And you go, no, don't tell me that. That's not a good thing to tell me. I want to hate them because they're not like me. No, Tibetan Buddhism mentally, I've never seen a Buddhist upset. Okay. I've never seen a Buddhist angry. I mean, a real, a teacher. I've never seen them egotistic. I've never seen, so they have all these fantastic super qualities. So whether they know it or not, they are living a Christian life. And they believe in Avalokiteshvara and Prajnaparamita and so on and so forth, which there's so many stories that go with every word I say. I would love to talk to you for an hour about Prajnaparamita and how that came about and how the Tibetan Buddhists define that and how they have mythologies about how wisdom came to the earth and all these things. Nobody else has that. Steiner doesn't even refer to many of those things because he has, as we pointed out, in Knowledge of Higher Worlds, he says that he has, by necessity, in all true spiritual development, you must link with the past, but then you must bring it forward. Now, I'm going to share something very simple with you, and that is how to reach enlightenment. And it's in the book. Matter of fact, it's, I think, on page 1, because I didn't want to mess around. I wanted to say, okay, you think enlightenment is all that? The Nyingmapa tradition, which means all the other Tibetan Buddhist 4 traditions and schools of thought, all believe this 100%. There's no Tibetan school that doesn't accept almost everything in terms of doctrine and dogma that the Bangpo religion believes. So this is taken from Nyingmapa, and it's called Dzogchen, which means the quickest way to enlightenment. Now, you're going to think this is crazy, but once you understand these words in the way and the definition and the terms that the Tibetan Buddhists use, and you know what these terms mean, and you know what the definition is, each of these little tiny phrases I'm going to read are a stage of development. And when you reach the final stage, you can instantaneously become enlightened. Instantaneously. It takes 20 seconds to read this. If you could understand it, and by the way, right now, when I read this, I go immediately into the realm of moral imagination. Why? Because I've trained for 20, 30 years in this, and all the hundreds of thousands of mantras, and basically those are prayers because they really are describing divine spiritual things. And basically it's called, you visualize, and then you evoke, you speak, and then you embody the deity. Well, that's what we're trying to do with Christ. You visualize Christ, you pray to him, and you try to embody him, and you say, not I, but Christ in me. One of the best prayers you can use. If you simply had the perpetual prayer of not I, but Christ in me, it will absolutely transform you, and it will lead you right through the stages of preparation into the possibility of enlightenment. But enlightenment happens because the light in your brain, and then the sound of your voice, and then the actions of your heart, the Tibetan Buddhists call that the lights, the sounds, and the word. And what they say is, as John pointed out, they're going to tell you you have to create emptiness, a void, nothing there, but it's not infinite, it's contained. Okay, if it's contained, how can it be a void? Okay, so these are nothing but paradoxes strung together in a row to basically get over the mental confounding that happens in your brain every time you think. Your brain is one of the biggest hindrances to enlightenment. You need to get out of your brain and get into your heart. And when you create this emptiness, and as they will say, emptiness then can create the condition for bliss. When they say bliss, they're saying enlightenment. But how does it come? It comes through light, through imagination, through sound, inspiration, and through word or love, because Christ is the logos, the word. He is love. And so when you can go into these stages, then you have the chance to go beyond enlightenment, go beyond the realm of the angels, and go into the realm of the archangels and the archai, which are the two stages of initiation above enlightenment. So in this book, we have multiple passages taken from Tibetan Buddhism, which many Buddhists have read and meditated, and then one time when they're doing it, they understand it, and bingo bango, they get enlightenment. Not only that, after that, then they study the different stages of initiation, and they attain the rainbow body, as they call it. And those are the two higher stages of initiation. So Steiner's point on with that, and basically he elucidates Buddhism, I'm sorry to have to say it, better than the Buddhists do. But this is taken from Tampa Shinrab Miwoche, which means Buddha Shinrab, who created Bompo, supposedly in Zhangzhung in 10,000 BC, around the time that Atlantis sunk. So this great leader, Tampa Shinrab Miwoche, domesticated horses. Well, you know how far back that goes. He was also the person who created many things that we have in modern spiritual development. But his phrasing, and I'm always looking for the exact phrases of Tampa Shinrab Miwoche because they're astounding. For instance, there's a tantra that he gives. When you read this tantra, literally people can attain enlightenment. And we have a few of those in here. I don't have that one because it's people wouldn't understand it quite so easily. I put some in here that Westerners could understand. And when you read this, you're going to go, wait, that's pure anthroposophy. Or wait, that's every spiritual path I know right here in 108 phrases in a row. And when you read them, it actually moves you into a stage of ascension. So I'm going to read this to you. And you might not think that this is profound, but I can tell you that many, 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 many people, probably millions of people, have attained enlightenment because they meditated on these few words. And this comes from Dawa Gyatso, but it is simply a modern interpretation of what Tampa Shinrab Miwoche said. Vision is mind. There's the light. Mind is empty. Emptiness is clear light. Clear light is union. Union is great bliss. That's the first stage. And why doesn't it go to sound and love? Because it's the first stage. Enlightenment is the first stage, and it's all talking about light, isn't it? And it tells you how to produce bliss and the spiritual light, clear light, in this emptiness, which, by the way, you don't fill it with light or sound or word. Your job is to become empty, to become the Holy Grail. Your heart is to become open and open to the divine above so that it can come in and fill you. But at first stage, it will fill you with light. It will fill you with moral imagination. I'll read it again. Vision is mind. Mind is empty. Emptiness is clear light. Clear light is union. Union is great bliss. Now, you might not think that's profound, but once you study it long enough and you say those things, you actually can create that emptiness. And then wisdom pours in, and the ability to have right action, everything that Buddha taught will then pour in, and those words will be given to you. And that's stage 2 and 3. That's the stages of initiation. And when you start to interact with these beings, you realize, holy moly, these are beings, as John pointed out. This isn't just some really nice truth or wisdom. No, these are beings. You are meeting Prajnaparamita. You're meeting Manjushri. You're meeting Avalokiteshvara. You're meeting Buddha in the spiritual world. And in our next talk, I think we will be talking a lot about what Steiner says in terms of indications about Buddha that no one has ever given. No Buddhist has ever taught this. But Rudolf Steiner, because he was clairvoyant, could go into these realms, meet these beings, commune with them, understand their history, their manifestation, and even their future. So I'm recommending this book to anyone who wants to get the quick path, because anthroposophy, many anthroposophists complain, I've read the basic books of Steiner, and I'm not even a little bit more clairvoyant. Well, that's because the mental training is only going to work if you have moral development beforehand. Steiner says for every step you take in spiritual development, you take two or three. Anyway, it takes three steps. Thank you. You take 3 steps in moral development. You're not going to get there without moral development. So no matter, you could become the most brilliant Tibetan scholar, and I have met them. I'm not going to mention any names, and they're not enlightened. They never got it. They didn't study the Nyingma tradition. They didn't study Dzogchen. They didn't know that they could reach enlightenment very quickly. They're waiting for some kind of magical thing to happen. The magical thing happens in total emptiness. You have to completely empty your mind, empty your heart, empty your own personal desires, and then the possibility for the lights, the sounds, and the word to then come into you and literally become the master teacher to you. You do not need a guru. You do not need an old path or an old lineage. You do not need anything but yourself and Christ in your heart to reach the stage of enlightenment and the 2 further stages of initiation.
Yes, and it's when Rudolf Steiner indicates that for every step that you need 3 steps of moral development. Well, why is that? What does that mean? But if you think it through, you realize, well, that's, of course, anthroposophically thought, word, and deed, right? That it like everything else has a way in which it can be approached through a 3-fold understanding. And so when one comes to these things, that you'll find that there is an evolution within the realm of thought. There's an evolution within the realm of initiation. Initiation isn't the same thing that it was before the incarnation of Christ at the mystery of Golgotha. It underwent a complete transformation, but it happened gradually. And so you have to keep that in mind. You go, okay, when was this text created? It doesn't give much consideration for the individual human-eyed, the ego. Well, that's because it was too early. And so that didn't play into it. And so that they can look at an individual human being and see them as a part of something more so than an individual like I am a Roman. The way it became ultimately when it evolved during the time of Christ was literally that finally that idea of being an independent individual had come to some level of development. And so you have that Roman persona, and you look at the statues of the Romans and compare them to the ancient Greek statues, and then from there to the ancient Egyptians, and you see that there's this gradual development to where finally you encounter an individual that's standing on earth and has self-reference in the complete sense of the word. And so we had to get to that point. We had to fall that far into Earth evolution, and that's that Mars period, entering into evolution. Now that we can fully grasp that we are here and that we are an I, now what we have to do is get to the point where we can offer it up. And so you have from the ancient East the image of a lily on a pond. Now, why is that? Well, if you look at a pond and there's all these waves, but then if you allow the pond to become still, it becomes a mirror like glass. And then when you see the reflection of the sun in the water, it can bring you to illumination.
Absolutely. Om Mani Padme Hum, hail thou jewel in the heart of the lotus. I want to thank you, John, because it was your encouragement that caused me to attempt what I thought was impossible, to link up anthroposophy and Buddhism. But I do believe that you and I and Tyler have produced a book that will be helpful to Buddhists, helpful to Christians, and really show that there is a bridge and there's a connection between Rudolf Steiner and the most ancient teachings, and that in fact, at their core, they really have many, many, many similarities, which so many anthroposophists would deny. So thank you, John, for giving me an impossible task, and thank you for helping me accomplish it.